So, good morning and a very warm welcome to EPC Update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me, as always, this week are Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, and our special guest, we're delighted to have her back with us, Daniela Schwarzer, who is an executive board member of the Bertelsmann Stiftung and a member of the EPC Strategic Council. As always, this will be a totally interactive conversation. So I'll ask our panel some questions, and then I hope to hear from all of you. Either click on the raised hands button if you would like to speak, and I will ask you to unmute yourself when the time comes, or click on the Q&A button. And can I ask, in either case, that your question is as brief as possible? So let us get underway. And this time we are focusing entirely on the European elections, taking place just over a month from now, of course. And we're looking at the potential outcome and the consequences. And Daniela, let's start, if I might, with you and just how much is at stake. Many people are calling these potentially the most consequential elections we've had since the first direct elections in 1979 because of these predictions of a surge in support for far right, for populists. What is your sense of that? And I'm wondering, linking this to a speech that the French President Emmanuel Macron made last week, when he warned that Europe was facing, he put it quite starkly, its possible demise. And he was saying, Europe is mortal, it can die, it only depends on our choices, and these choices have to be made now. Now, here he was referring, I think, mostly to the geopolitical context, but was there also a message for voters about just how much is at stake, do you think?
I think it was both. It is a statement on the geopolitical situation and the threats that Europe is facing, and in particular, Russia's war on Ukraine and the perspective of the US elections that, in my view, drives his thinking. But there's also the rise of China, and he said interesting things on the state of the European economic model, which were also pretty radical, but much less reflected, because in substance, he questioned whether the economic model in Europe still works. And if you take that as a context, and then you look at the European elections, and you look at the data which forecasts a rise in far-right parliamentarians in the parliament who come with an agenda that questions part of the achievements even of the EU, but also would make it far more difficult to take certain decisions. Of course, this looks like a very important election. But then also, there are 7 national elections in the EU this year. And we, of course, know that the big strategic decisions are mostly decided between the heads of state and government in the European Council when it comes to the really big issues. And so it is, I think, pretty clear that Macron's message was both one on the geopolitics of the situation, on the responsibility that member states need to take, but then also the responsibility of voters when they go to the polls at the end of May and into early June.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Fabian, for you, would you, your sense of just how important these elections might be for the future of Europe. And as Daniela said, these elections coupled with those national elections, which will obviously also influence the way Europe moves in future.
I think we have to see these elections in context. It's not only these elections, as Daniela already mentioned. I mean, we have national elections as well. But we have a global election here. We have a very important, arguably a more important election across the Atlantic, where we will see whether we have the catastrophe of a Trump 2 administration. I think this is within a context of overall instability, overall fragmentation, a geopolitical, a geoeconomic situation, which is extremely challenging for Europe and for democracy more generally. So yes, it is important as part of that overall process. And I think the big fear, I would say, is that the outcome of this election might further cement the paralysis which is there in a number of countries, where we are the rabbit in the headlight. We're seeing all these crises happening, but we are becoming increasingly unable to respond to them. And a bad outcome of this election will just further cement that trend.
Thank you very much. And I want to come back to whether you think paralysis in terms of the day-to-day EU decision-making is also possible, likely, but also what impact it might have on the EU's constant discussion at the moment about internal reforms. But we'll come back on all of that a little bit later. Janis, just complete the picture for us in terms of just how much is at stake.
It still happens. I was muted. Sorry for that.
It always will.
Yeah, but I agree with what Daniela and Fabian said. I think that it's obvious that the upcoming EP elections have a high significance because of the situation both in Europe but also at the global level we are experiencing, the level of uncertainty which is also in front of us. So it will matter what will come out of these elections. One, for the potential implications at the European level, the composition of the European Parliament was already mentioned. It will also have an effect on the next commission, the next commission president, the priorities of the next commission. But what I am also worried about is what effects it might have at the national level, how it might influence European policy making at the national level, and that it will play into the hands of those who are Eurosceptic, who are very critical of the EU, or want to actually, if they could, get rid of it, that those voices will be strengthened in national debates, and that these parties will also argue, look how well we did in the EP elections. So when it comes to Europe, our position are of a bigger significance than maybe some of our positions at the national level. So I think the national effects, are things to worry about. And if you follow what the speech of Macron, but also his interview, he was obviously also directing himself towards the French, because he knows what the significance is of a potential negative outcome from his perspective of the elections in France and what that might mean for the future of the political system in his own country. Plus, there's a lot at stake also for himself. But then there's a huge discrepancy between what we're now saying, which is that these elections do really matter, and the fact that I do not really witness a big excitement at the national level when it comes to the ECP elections. And if you follow the debate, which happened this week in Maastricht among the lead candidates, it was not that there were millions of people watching. There were hundreds of thousands watching, so that was not too bad. But given what is at stake and what we are arguing, it shows that the interest for European issues is not as high as it should be, given the situation.
I want to get a sense from you later on of what we learned, or what we might have learned from that debate between the candidates. But coming back on this point, Daniela, of Janis saying there, it's not really a European election. I mean, traditionally, what tends to happen is voters vote, and the whole debate is on national issues, and governments that are unpopular get a kicking, and governments that, and parties that are doing well do well here. What is your sense this time? Are we seeing, do you think, any common European themes? Is it possible to campaign at all on the European level, or does that simply switch voters off?
Well, if we look back 5 years, we saw that fighting climate change and defining a green agenda for the EU, not only internally for its own green transition, but also its global role. This was not only a shared campaign issue, but it really mobilized young voters who went to the polls in higher numbers than had been the case before. Right now, and I would say the country I know best is Germany, and we are still very much at the start of the campaign, which, is a little worrisome because the whole narrative has to be built in a very difficult geopolitical situation, as we have just discussed. And interestingly, the green issue is present among some parties, of course. It's very present among the Greens, also among the rather small campaign of Volt. But then the other two parties, and the Liberals, so the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, they campaign on very different issues. The Social Democrats have decided to campaign on peace, which is a very difficult debate in Germany at the moment. Of course, it is about bringing peace to Ukraine and bringing stability and a new security order to our continent. But it is also a very domestic thing at the moment, because we have an inner German debate with, in particular, the more radical-leaning parties, the far-right AfD, but also the new movement, the Sarah Wagenknecht leftist movement, who basically say, we are in opposition to this government, but also the EU governments who support Ukraine through weapons, and we are the party that stands for peace. And it's very difficult to develop the narrative. And this is right now happening, and the Social Democrats are really trying to do so on the national, but also on the European level, why supporting Ukraine actually will bring peace to our continent and why it's a necessary element. And this is very interesting and could spread to other countries as well. If you look at the strongest statements that the French president has recently made, and I think we can assume that most of European-related or international politics-related statements right now are always in the mind of leading politicians, also seen in the dynamic of the European elections. He also came out very strongly, again, in the Economist interview, which was just published, on a scenario where Europe has to double down in its support for Ukraine. He keeps bringing in the ground troop issue, but I think basically the security issue will very likely be the uniting theme with those different interpretations that I've given, which are at this point very present in the German debate.
And it is striking, if you look at the latest Eurobarometer poll, it talks about people putting, when the voters are asked what are their concerns, they put poverty and social exclusion first at 33% and public health at 32%. But in joint third place comes the economy, job creation, and EU defence and security. And I don't think it would have come in third place, certainly not 5 years ago. But there is a change in the tone. Janis, just to pick up on what you said, and then Fabian, I'll come to you. In terms of the degree to which the campaign, do you think security will be the big issue? Do you think there is a possibility of some campaigning on these common European themes, or will it remain very much a national debate? And in one sense, I suppose my question to you is, does it matter if people are talking about the issues and Europe is part of the issue rather than debating Europe itself? Is that a problem?
Well, first of all, and this is a common truth, there are huge differences between member states. And obviously, in a good number of countries, especially those which are geopolitically and geographically most closest to Ukraine, the issue of security and defense is trumping everything. It is the issue. It's the predominant issue because people fear that things could go massively wrong. They fear that the impact of the war in Ukraine, in case Ukraine is defeated, might be much stronger on them than many in the West think that it potentially might. Western Europe, I mean, and might be on them. So there is geography matters, obviously, but I think that also in other countries, security and defense is high on the agenda. There is a general understanding that what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening also at the global level, the US elections and the fear of potentially having a Trump 2 administration, these are concerns which are in the heads of many people. But having said all that, it was interesting also in Maastricht, where they ask young people to decide on what the candidate should be discussing, that the green issue was also high on the agenda. So you were quoting Eurobarometer numbers, which indicate that it's not among the top 3 or 4. But on the other hand, I think that for many, and also for younger voters, and Daniela was alluding to that, green is still an issue which is highly significant given the reality of climate change around us. But then having said that, I think what you really, I try to witness as many as possible campaigns in member states. What the strongest messages we're getting, again, no surprises, that parties are arguing we're the ones who will defend the interest of our country best. So a strong voice in Europe from a German perspective, from a French perspective, and so forth. So the logic still is not, how do we produce common goods and how do we have a debate about issues which we're all concerned about, but how do we make sure that our interests are best represented? Because it still is this notion of us against the others within the European, rather than us together against the challenges which we have to face. I think that is a basic problem which we still continue to face.
And of course, on the green issue that you mentioned there for young people a very important issue, wanting to see action. Of course, also very important on the other side of the debate. We've seen the farmers' protests, and we've seen the response from EU leaders trying in an election year to address their concerns about the Green Deal, industry's concerns. Fabian, from your perspective, and let me link this, if I can, also to the question of turnout, because Daniela said there's not much excitement, and it's true. I mean, America seems to be in permanent campaign mode from the moment a president is elected till the next one. The UK has been the country I know best in election fever for about 2 years now. We are a month to go, and you'd barely know they were happening. Does that, why do you think that is? And does it matter? And I wanted to ask all of you, because the thing that people comment on most about in the elections, always the first thing they talk about is the turnout. Is it up? Is it down? And they read huge significance into it. And my question to all of you is, should we read huge significance? But Fabian first, please.
Well, firstly, just to react on the defense and security in the Eurobarometer, I think my question really would be, why is it not higher? And for me, what it actually shows is that for large parts of Europe, this is still not our war. This is still something which is happening somewhere else. I think Janis is absolutely right. For those who are directly on the border, who actually see the threat, yes, it is their war. But for many others, it is a concern, but it shows that it is not the highest priority because they don't feel it really affects them to the degree which it actually does, or which it potentially will if it goes in the wrong direction. But that also means that we're not really having a debate at the European level around the trade-offs which are there and around the difficult choices. What we're actually seeing, and that's in response to your question about does it matter, what we're seeing is that it's going to reinforce the national taboos. It's going to reinforce the bits where different governments, different parties are saying, well, we can't move because we can't sell that to our citizens. It's the British disease all over again. We cannot do anything in Europe because whatever we do is going to be unpopular at home, so best not to do anything. And that also opens the door for the anti-parties, because the anti-parties are very good at just saying we are against everything. But if the mainstream parties are not showing that they can offer an alternative to that, then it will strengthen them further. So it does matter. And I think what we are going to see, unfortunately, is a very national debate, a debate which doesn't really tackle the difficult choices which Europe faces. I mean, even, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but even if you look at the different priorities, what these priorities all have in common is that every one of them will take an enormous amount of investment, an enormous amount of money, which is going to have to come from somewhere. And there's no possibility that we can do all of that at the same time. So we have to have that debate, but maybe I'm being a bit too naive in believing that during an election campaign, you can have a sensible political debate.
And on the question of turnout?
I think, yes, we will look at turnout, but I think this is at very best a fickle indicator. It doesn't really tell us very much about the underlying health of the political system. Maybe it can be seen as a signal that some of these issues matter to people, but even that, I think there is a danger that in many countries people will just simply say, I'm sick of politics. It's not actually about the issues, it's about elites, it's about what they up there are doing, and I don't want to get involved in that in any case.
Janis, you want to jump in, and then I want to come to Daniela on this question of turnout.
Yeah, you want me to start with the turnout one?
No, I think you wanted to react to something Fabian said.
No, I think that Fabian's analysis is correct, but I would add to this something, which is that when you talk to national politicians who are dealing with EU affairs from different member states, and you discuss about the situation we are living in, and the fact that we actually need to be very honest towards voters in expressing the potential consequences if things turn negatively in the different areas, which obviously, if you do that, creates a rather negative analysis of what the situation actually is and looks like. And many politicians tell you, we cannot do this. This is something we cannot, dare to confront our voters with, because this analysis is so bleak, so negative, we can't do it. And I think it's wrong. I think this is the wrong appreciation. I think that many people have severe worries. And I think avoiding having a discussion about the difficult, tough things that are likely to happen, I think is doing exactly the wrong thing. Because if you would have that debate, not only would people understand that you have understood, but you could also then say what needs to be done. But these politicians, and that probably is, basic part of their DNA, fear that if they do that, they will play into the hands of the anti-forces. Because the argument being, well, if the situation is as bad as you are saying, and potentially it might develop even worse, why should I then vote you, who have been mainstream partisan in power for such a long time? This is their argument. But I think that there is a danger that this eventually will backfire. It's just, pushing or kicking the can further down the road. Whereas we need that honest debate, which Fabian was already talking about.
Thank you. Before we come to turn out, Daniela, I don't know whether you want to react on that point that both of them has made.
I yes, do want to. I think they are both exactly right. And, the question of war and peace on our continent, how to get there and what the cost of non-action is of course, the huge and central issue, in my view, at the moment. But if you look at the other issues we are discussing at the moment, or not discussing extensively enough during the electoral campaign, for instance, the question of EU enlargement. These are fundamental questions as to the size, the geography, and the functioning of the EU of the future. And I agree with the assessment that some policymakers tend to think, oh, these are just too big and too difficult. So maybe if we don't talk about them and talk about rather concrete issues which we can make happen, that is the easier way. But given the fact that citizens very well perceive that politics by now is really crisis-driven, and it's very responsive to the next bad thing that happens, I think taking a step back and giving a vision and a positive way forward, because we still have we have a treasure, and that is the EU. We have a huge market. We have huge achievements when it comes to human rights, civil liberties, and all of these things. And we shouldn't forget that, and we should be positive about that. I just wish to add one point, which really is important for understanding how the demography of our electorate is changing. In Germany alone, this year around 9.8% of voters are first-time voters. This is because we have lowered the election age to 16, and also because in any case, 5 years after the last European elections, there are a lot of first-time voters. But this is a huge group, and this is why campaigns have to do one extra thing, or in other ways, politics and also the education system. It has to explain to young voters why these elections matter, and that they have a real choice, and that if they take it as a second-order election where they easily cast a protest vote, that this can make real damage. There are other countries where there are similar high or almost as high percentages of first-time voters, and we really shouldn't forget this group. Again, going back to what happened 5 years ago, when young voters came in very strongly for the Green New Deal issue. So a good campaign, which is really forward-looking and has some fresh ideas how to design the future in Europe, I think that could really move people.
Yes, it is quite striking, isn't it, Daniela, just to follow up on that, and another figure from the Eurobarometer survey, 71%, and I found this figure in the current challenging circumstances quite striking. 71% say on balance their country benefits from membership of the EU. There is a strong sense that the EU matters, and I'm just wondering really what you feel in terms of that positive message. You talked about youngsters, but to maintain that sense that the EU is a positive benefit, when it comes to the mainstream parties, who of course are facing the populists who are, it's very easy to be against and anti-EU and anti-everything really, but not offer solutions. How important is it that they are being offered concrete solutions, examples of how the EU really can deliver? Do you think, that expectation delivery, we talk about it a lot, expectation delivery gap that the EU has. How much of a risk is that, do you think?
Well, I think it is a risk, and I do think that the higher rates than in previous years, about the EU's benefits for single member states, in some ways will have to do with the cost of Brexit for the UK. That is, of course, nothing to campaign on. This is just, a conclusion to draw from what is happening in the UK at the moment. I think this positive message is extremely important. And that's no contradiction to what I said earlier when I said we have to have a positive view and a positive vision and emphasize the achievements of Europe, but turn them towards the future and say this is what our Europe should look like, in opposition to authoritarian states, which we talk about so much, and we talk about them as a threat. But what we rarely do is we say why we are the better model, why we really want to make sure that our model survives and that we have so much to get from it. And now, linking what you just asked about the concrete deliverables to what people think is so important and they expect from the EU, the numbers you gave earlier, where the socio-economic fears that people have come in very strongly. If you look at what's happening in certain member states, you can clearly understand why this is so. The loss of purchasing power in times of high inflation, for instance, makes people feel that they are socioeconomically threatened, and that the typical question always is, will your kids be better off than you yourself? We see higher numbers of people who say, no, my kids won't be better off than I am. And this used to be the injection of hope. Right? And that's why people, look positively towards the future. So I do honestly believe that the EU has to, first of all, highlight what it did deliver. And again, here I'm in this sort of review of what happened during the crisis. If you look at the way, after initial problems, but then still, the EU contributed to handling the COVID crisis, the joint procurement of vaccines, for instance. These are achievements which could be emphasized. The fact that the EU has moved quite a bit since Russia attacked Ukraine, not enough on security and defense measures, certainly, but in the field of energy policy, there has been progress. Again, not enough. But these successes can be built on, and then this narrative can be developed, what the EU can concretely deliver for citizens, in particular in those areas they are most worried about.
Thank you. We've been focusing on the campaign so far. I want to switch to the consequences in a moment, but Fabian and Janis, you both wanted to react to what Daniela said.
Just to add on the COVID issue, I think this is also a very interesting example to look at from a political perspective, because what we saw during COVID was that those leaders who were honest, who were credible, who were, yes, emphasizing that this is going to be difficult, that they didn't have all the answers, but at the same time saying we have to tackle this together. Those were the ones who were most popular, who were most trusted by populations. And I think that, for me, would be the kind of image which our leaders should be projecting now. It is a different kind of crisis, but it is an equally grave crisis. And I think it is not enough to just simply say we are going to deal with certain issues which are on the agenda, getting lost also in some of the detail. But there has to be this message about, one, the severity of the situation which we're in, but then also the credibility of the people who are there to say, no, we are going to tackle this, and we're going to do this in a way which is difficult, but in a way which also gets to the heart of the problems which we are facing.
Just to throw in a comment really from one of our audience. We talked earlier about the Green Deal, Janis, and someone saying, this anonymous person says the Green Deal target setting was an example of ineffective self-inflicting policy making, i.e. capping EU emissions while the world is carrying on unimpressed. What other options do voters have than a move away from established parties? I mean, do you think voters have to broaden that question really, a sense that they have real choices in these elections, or is part of what we're talking about here, we're talking about hope, but also a sense of powerlessness, and whether that, linking that to the issue of turnout. I mean, I was absolutely astonished to see the Eurobarometer had 71% of people indicating they were likely to vote this time. Now, the turnout was 51% last time, first time it's increased in a very long time. I cannot believe 70% of people are going to turn out and vote, but maybe I've become unduly cynical after 30 odd years following Brussels politics. But your sense of what motivates and drives people to turn out, Janis?
Let me start with something else, reflecting on what Daniela was saying, and also what you were asking, because I think that, yes, there is an appreciation among a lot of people that Europe matters. And I think also beyond that, there are high expectations of what people have from the European Union. If you ask them about what the EU should be doing, they will tell you it should be doing ABC, which relates to some of the biggest problems they feel, which shows that they have a hope that the European Union will do more about some of the things which they are worried about, including, by the way, in security and defense, but not only. So for me, I think there's a disillusionment about what actually is being done at the European level. And here's a discrepancy, because if people want the EU to do more, and they become disillusioned about the EU because they feel that it is not doing enough, there's a discrepancy between that feeling and what we, as member states, as EU 27, are ready to do. I do not see that we have a strong agreement on how we should deal in certain areas. We had the last summit dealing with Capital Markets Union, an issue, a decade old, and now we're pushing for it, but we know how difficult the positions are between member states. We had a discussion on the midterm review of the EU budget, where we saw how difficult it was to get even close to what the Commission had been asking for, which is probably lagging behind what we actually need at the European level. So there's a discrepancy between what member states, governments are ready to cooperate and work on, and the level of ambition they have, and the expectation which citizens have, and that creates a disillusionment. And I would add to that something which I find extremely worrisome, that there is also disillusionment among a lot of multipliers when it comes to political debates. People who feel that the EU is not corresponding to what needs to be done, and these multipliers have an effect on the public opinion in more general. Whether these are journalists, whether these are politicians, whether these are even experts dealing with EU affairs. So delusionment is something which is also can be seen among multipliers, and I think that has effect on the public debate. The last point on the turnout. I think the turnout does matter. It matters not because of what sign it is giving, but the higher the turnout, the less likely that the anti-forces will do even better than some fear. So the turnout matters because we know that anti-forces can mobilize their voters much more than traditional mainstream parties can. So the turnout matters. But for me, I question, and I agree with you, Jacki, I question as to whether the 71% of those who say that they're likely to vote will actually do vote. And I mean, I hope that we will reach the level of turnout we had last time. But I think the response to the question, are you likely to vote, relates to another fear which people have, and we have mentioned that explicitly. And it's not being mentioned as the key objectives and themes when you ask voters, which is the fear for the future of democracy or liberal democracy. And people have the fear with respect to democracy. So they say, I will go to vote, but do they then actually do it? Which relates back to, are they disillusioned with what they're actually seeing on the ground? So there is a fear of democracy, and I think that it's the silent majority which hopefully will stand up and say, I'll go to vote, because it does matter, because it's also about not only the future of policy areas, but it also relates to the future of democracy in Europe.
Yeah, I want to move on to outcomes and potential consequences, but Verena Ringler from our audience, really echoing, Daniela, what you said about, to outside observers, says Verena, the achievements of the EU are huge in this legislature. Despite war, pandemic, a huge bulk of Green Deal laws have passed. We have a European climate law, Fit for 55 package, most of the decarbonisation legislation. On the tricky side, there are some things that have been put in the fridge, but there is, she suggests, a message of success here, and foremost for the EPP and also for Macron. And why aren't they capitalising this? I think it's more of a philosophical question about, Is it because they've just decided they're not campaigning on EU issues broadly? But let's come to what this all means. And I'd like to take this in two parts, because you've all talked about the impact at the European level and the impact on the national level and the sort of circle between them, what happens at the national level and how that feeds back. Looking at the European Parliament itself, first of all, and then we'll broaden to the impact for the rest of the EU. If the predictions are right, and if up to 1/4 of MEPs come from populist parties, come from far-right anti-EU parties, so we have a much more fragmented European Parliament with these anti-forces of different kinds. Do you think that is the likely outcome? Are we exaggerating it? I mean, I remember from the last election, many fears that we would have a parliament so much more fragmented that it wouldn't be able to function. Turned out not to be the case. Do you think, Daniela, we're in the same territory, or is it different this time? And could we see a really fractured assembly afterwards?
I think there is a higher risk, but at the moment, I think one of the big questions really is how will the politically right party families be composed in parliament? How do the parliamentary groups shape up? And will they be able to take strong positions together that can actually prevent the traditional coalitions which shape up in the European Parliament, who usually work, sometimes in a tedious but then consensus-oriented manner and get things done, as we heard over the last legislature. So I think that's one of the major questions. And the big issue that is divisive in the far-right party families is, of course, the strategy towards Ukraine and the general position on Russia. So I think what we will see is within the parliament, indeed a recomposition with some weakening of the political center. I think we will hear more aggressive tones, as we do in national policy debates, the degree of polarization, the radicalization of discourse, and all of this, this doesn't stay on the national level. This will feed into the European Parliament. But I do think we will still have a parliament where the moderate parties can pass laws. I just think that the risk is here, and Janis said that earlier on, that what happens in those European elections, where surely there will be some protest vote, which may lead to results which look pretty horrible, this will spill back on the national level. And the risk is that the interpretation is that on the national level, you cannot live on politically well with a strong pro-European stance, and you have to be more nuanced and more critical. So I think that will change. And then for some issues, there will be concrete implications. I think for the whole green debate, obviously for the migration debate, which has already shifted. But we are also facing very important discussions over the question of the future financial framework of the EU and the question of who pays for what and what the resources of the European Union of the future should actually be. And those, I think, will be among the three particularly divisive issues.
Thank you. Fabian, the EPC published a paper last month by some of your colleagues on the question, and the paper intriguingly said that basically the issue was not really what the far right do, because it argued they can't get their act together. The evidence shows they tend to remain terribly fragmented, but it's what the centre, the EPP, the centre-right party does in response, if we do see a big surge in the number of MEPs from those parties, whether they start to shift their political position, how they play it. Indeed, I have seen predictions, yes, that the S&D, EPP and Renew together could have a comfortable majority, but also that the right could have a majority for the first time. But that would mean the EPP getting into bed with the other centre, the more far right forces. What is your sense of how this is likely to play out?
Well, I've lost Jacki for the moment, but I'll try to answer the question she started. I do think that the impact is potentially more grave than in the past. Also because we shouldn't forget that the far right has never really been about working in the parliament. It has been about using the parliament as a platform, as a source of funding, as a source of standing. There are many things you can do within the parliament which have nothing to do with the legislative program and how you're passing through it. And I think we have seen some of the actors being very effective in that. I think what we will also see is that, and we have already started to see, it increases the friction between the pro-European central groups. Because, as you've just said, there is this question about where does the EPP position itself? And if it positions itself, as seemed to be indicated, with ECR more, what does that then mean about the willingness of the other parties in the center to work with the EPP or even work with ECR at that point in time? So I think what we're actually going to see is that the range of contentious issues gets bigger, and that it gets harder to then get anything through, which in addition to this political split, which we have, we're also seeing increasingly a national split. It's not necessarily the case anymore that the people within a particular family all vote together, depending on what the issue is on the table. So I think it is a picture of much more fragmentation. And then we come to very big ticket items like the EU budget, which is always contentious, even in the best of times. This time around, it's going to be very, very bitter, very, very aggressively fought, with very much dogmatic positions being put down. So I do think we are actually facing a situation where the legislative machinery is not going to function as well as it did in the past. Certainly not when it comes to contentious issue, and that range of issues is going to be bigger. But I just wanted to add one other thing. I think it's not only what happens at EU level and what happens at national level, but I think we should also look at what does this mean internationally.
Can we come
Because
back on
if
that
we
in a
have
moment?
that fragmentation, it also gives a signal to the rest of the world.
Yeah, let's come back on that issue of international. And you seem to have lost me for a moment. I didn't lose you, so I heard you. There is also someone in our audience, Alexander Gerritsen and Janis, throwing into the mix. I was talking about what the EPP does, referring to the EPC paper. This is a question about what the ECR does, and a suggestion that they might be moving, wanting a closer relationship with the EPP, moving to become a more centrist group. So we have so many different ramifications of what could happen. What is your reading of, I think what I'm reading so far is, yes, the EU, the Parliament, will continue to play its role, but it will be more difficult on more issues. I want to come back on two issues later, the international question and also what impact this has on the internal EU reform debate. But first, in terms of the day-to-day business, the legislative business, Janis.
Well, first of all, my assumption, and I think that is the assumption of all of us, is that the right, the radical right, extreme right, will do well in these elections. So those parties who have been part of ECR and the ID group, will do well, will do better than they did 5 years ago. And that, by the way, is not correlating as much as it did 5 years ago to the turnout, which played a decisive part last time around, because a lot of voters went, much more than 2014, and that undermined the success of the radical right, who, if you remember back in early 2019, we were thinking that they would do very well. But this time we see that they have the wind in their sails also at the national level. They're doing very well at the national level, and that will then be simply reflected also at the European level. So they will be stronger. The conservatives and the socialists probably close to where they have been, and the big losers are Renew, and especially the Greens. They will lose a lot. That's what the predictions look like. And I think that they are sound, and it's 1 month ahead of the elections. They will lose. So the majority, the mainstream majority, will become smaller in the European Parliament. With respect to the cooperation between ECR and ID, there are some in the Parliament, within the Parliament, who fear that their level of cooperation might be higher next time around, despite all their differences, which both Daniela and Fabian were alluding to. That for practical reasons, for reasons of trying to get into certain positions, especially in the European Parliament, will be able and ready to cooperate better than they did in the past. So then the argument comes in, if that's the case, you need to make sure that the borders between the mainstream party and those forces will be really closed, the political borders. And that's where I think the biggest danger is. And here the EPP plays the key role as to how open it will be, incorporated with some, especially in ECR, especially with Fratelli d'Italia and Meloni, how strong they will be ready to cooperate and what repercussion that then has on the traditional mainstream grand coalition. Because there will be repercussions from the socialists and others who will be arguing, well, if you cooperate with them, don't count on us. So that then has a negative effect on the political constellations within the parliament. And by the way, at the debate in Maastricht, at some point, Ursula von der Leyen was asked, will you be ready to be supported by those forces? And her answer was, depends on the composition of the parliament and who will belong to which group. So she was already indicating in which direction that game might go. And that leads me to the last point. That is really dangerous because last time around, Ursula von der Leyen had a 7-vote majority in a secret ballot in the European Parliament. And also, if you go back to 2014 and 2009, the vote of the Commission President was very close. So there's a chance that she might not get a majority. And that means you start off the new cycle with a huge potential chaos, political chaos. If she doesn't get through and you have to find a new commission president, you potentially have to resettle the entire package. So you start on a very negative foot, and that will have repercussion, I think, for the then 5 years in terms of the political constellations, fragmentation in the parliament.
What do you think the odds of that happening are?
I think they're high. Look, her support in the EPP, I mean, Ursula von der Leyen's support in the EPP is not very strong. That's one problem. Now you could argue, well, if push comes to shove, they will be voting for her because they will prefer her to someone else. So they will go for the EPP candidate. But if they then lose also parliamentarians on the side of the socialists, Renew and Greens, then it could be extremely close, or potentially she might not have a majority in the parliament. And by the way, that vote that's what the parliament says, will happen after the summer break. So in September, not in July. Last time we had the vote in July, we had a president-elect. So now it might be later. So this could actually, I'm not saying it will happen. I'm saying there's a risk that there might be this kind of a chaos.
Okay, I want to come to what all this can mean. We talked earlier, and you talked, Fabian, about the priorities for the new commission, the new agenda of the council, strategic agenda of the council. But just before I do that, Daniela, we talked about the day-to-day business of the EU. In terms of that bigger debate about the future direction of the EU, about its internal workings, you mentioned enlargement earlier, that debate about how the EU needs to reform itself to have the capacity to act as it gets bigger and in the face of these challenges. What impact do you think these elections might have on that conversation?
Well, first question is, how will the campaign seize these issues and use the momentum to inform citizens about the geopolitical needs of enlargement and how we can actually make it happen? Because this has been a topic for a very long time now. Some of the currently negotiating countries have done so for 2 decades. So there's a whole credibility issue to tackle as well within the EU, but also vis-a-vis candidate countries, that now the EU is serious. So the campaign will matter. Now, then afterwards, the results of the election will also matter. But I would say as much the European electoral results as the development of domestic situations. We briefly touched upon the fact that there will be 7 national elections, which will also play a role, because whatever composition of government comes out, there will be a more proactive government that is ready to seize the big European issues. And then there will be some who will say, really not on top of my agenda. And then there are others who will argue for a quick enlargement without reform, because they feel the quicker you enlarge, the more they will be able to shape the EU according to their interests. And that may mean less Europe, and in particular, a less strong defense of rule and law and democracy. I just want to give one precise example here. If you look at who right now argues for quick enlargement and no reform of the EU, you see that in particular Viktor Orban is very vocal on that issue. That can be explained because obviously Hungary is in breach of the rule of law principle in the EU still. There's pressure on Hungary to change. And Hungary well knows that the more governments change their position towards more tolerance for this kind of behavior, the easier it is. If in the parliament you have a stronger reflection of those arguments because some parties come in which equally question the rule of law and liberal democracy within the EU, you know, this situation becomes more comfortable for certain member states. So I do believe that the electoral results matter, but also what happens on the national levels needs to be really, really studied, and we need to take issue with certain positions. That's why I come back to the point, we need to have this debate on what the EU of the future should look like, what its current normative base is, what all countries have signed when they joined the EU, which principles they signed up to respect, and how this then translates into the capacity of the EU to enlarge, be more capable to act, and still protect those principles. I think those are central questions, and I hope they will be approached in the electoral campaigns, but then in particular afterwards as well.
And indeed, that was a discussion that was supposed to have started with the Conference on the Future of Europe, on that great exercise in citizens' participatory democracy. Bertelsmann Stiftung, part of the EU Democracy Reform Observatory with the EPC and others looking at this whole role of citizens' participation, doesn't seem, just to briefly follow up, Daniela, doesn't seem to have made any difference in terms of engaging with citizens properly on these issues on an ongoing basis. And then I'm coming to you, Fabian.
Yes, well, I would agree that not enough has been done with the results. And of course, the European Parliament has turned into the one actor that has embraced them and has argued for reforms and keeps going back in different ways to the fact that there was a conference on the future of Europe and there is a result which is interesting, ambitious, and legitimized through citizens' direct participation. So, you know, while I fully agree, I would have wished for much more follow-up and more precise action. I do think the example has been set. And as it is on the EU level and on the national level, the reform of democracies to integrate participatory elements, that takes a very long time. The risk is, of course, that citizens are frustrated. So it's of crucial importance that we keep emphasizing, if anyone decides to run a participatory format, you need to live with the results, and not in the sense of shelving them, but in the sense of taking them seriously and predefining a process which you then respect what you want to do with them.
Yeah.
I'm
linking this, Fabian, to that broader question of the EU reforming the way it works. That's one element of it. Many other issues to be addressed in terms of giving the EU the capacity to act. How do you see these elections impacting on that broader debate? Are they going to make it even more difficult for the EU to get its own house in order to prepare for enlargement?
I think we have to make a distinction between what type of action are we talking about. I think the reality is that when it comes to big legislative agendas, I think that is going to be extremely difficult. However, there are a lot of tools which are already there, which could be used. Of course, it always depends on member states actually wanting to use them. But when we look at, for example, decision making, we've known for a very long time that there are different options already on the table. But what we are not seeing, and I don't see how this election is going to positively influence this in any way, is a real willingness to engage in this debate in any of the countries. None of the countries is really willing to say, what am I going to give up to get a European consensus on moving forward? What is the area where I'm also willing to go back to my electorate and to say, if we want to have an EU which can do these kind of things, then we have to change something. So I'm afraid we're in a situation where we are making big promises in some areas. Enlargement is clearly a promise has been made. But it's going to be extremely difficult to actually fulfill that, to make sure that this is also a convincing way where we're taking the citizens with us. And I think that's the one thing with Orban and others, which we really are already starting to see, and which is going to get much stronger, is what they are going to argue is that there is an alternative narrative. And that alternative narrative is not about anti-EU, at least they're going to claim it's not anti-EU, but it's about a different EU, an EU of nation states, an EU which protects our culture, our identity, which does all of the things which some of these parties have been promising at the national level for a long time. And that's a recipe for paralysis, because what we then end up with is essentially the inability to make any decisions. And when it comes to the big items like enlargement, like budget, where you need a unanimous vote, it's going to be extremely difficult to get to that.
Janis, a word to that, if you would. And then you watched the Spitzenkandidaten debate in Maastricht earlier this week. You referred to it earlier. Did that give us clues when it comes to saying what all of this will mean for the Council's 2024 to 2029 strategic agenda, for the new Commission's priorities? Did you glean clues from that that help us to anticipate the likely shape of those agendas?
Happy to answer that, but let me link a couple of things which have been said. Starting with Fabian's point of there is a danger that those who have a different idea and narrative about the EU in mind might prevail, and that the fundamental principles which Daniela was alluding to might be undermined exactly by those forces. Now, Conference on the Future of Europe, we've discussed it often, was a construct which worked in a certain way and did not achieve the potential objectives it could have achieved because it was set up on purpose the way it was set up. And it was particularly the Council. Most member states were very critical of the conference, and they were undermining the potential ability of the conference outcome to have an effect. Why? Because they fear that that might undermine their power in the system. They might undermine their role when it comes to setting the priorities, when it comes to potentially reforming the EU. And they feared that it would strengthen potentially the European Parliament. So this assessment still is us versus them. So I assume that some in the Council might think that if the Parliament, given what we were discussing earlier related to the EP elections, the next Parliament will be weaker than the previous one, that might actually play into their hands. Because the Parliament has been the one who was pushing for the conference, who has the most ambitious agenda when it comes to reforming the European Union, also linking this to enlargement. So if the Parliament, the next Parliament, is strategically, politically weaker because of its internal fragmentation, there could be some in the Council who say, this is in our interest. Not because they have this interinstitutional balance in mind, and they also do not want the EU to go too far, what I was talking about earlier when it comes to disillusionment, including on EU reforms. Because when it comes to reforms, it is the Parliament which is pushing towards higher levels of reform, both with respect to governance and with respect to policy reforms. And you have a commission, if you look into the latest reports by the commission when it comes to the review of policies and the review of the governance structures in light of enlargement, is extremely cautious in expressing itself. When it comes to EU reform, it's even lagging behind what the Juncker Commission was saying in terms of the level of ambition. So what I'm telling you is you get an entire picture of all these elements together, and they could analytically then tell us that what is ahead of us is going to be more difficult. What we have seen in terms of the ability of the EU to respond to the narrative, to the counter narrative, and to the needs we have of what we need to do in terms of reforming the EU, in terms of governance and in policy review.
Yeah, and the clues from the Maastricht debate to the next.
The Maastricht debate was you had 9 people on the stage, 1.5 hours. Everyone had a very limited time to speak, 3 issues. And at the end of the day, you had one person who actually has a chance to become next Commission president. And that is what mostly the Spitzenkandidaten is about. So you didn't really get much out of that debate. By the way, the strongest in the debate was the Green, one of the 2 Green top candidates. And the weakest was, Exactly, and the weakest was the German liberal candidate. But at the end, it was a Ursula von der Leyen show, and the others were playing into our hands. But again, I was alluding to the decisive moment when it came to how much she would be ready to be supported by radical forces. And otherwise, it was very much along the lines of what you can expect it. So the left candidate said what you would expect it, the Green candidate what he expected, and so on. So it was not really giving you strong indications. And it definitely will not change how the European Council would define its strategic agenda.
Can I just ask, linked to that, on the question of the Green Deal, someone in our audience saying the EU is falling short of its climate targets. We are reaching 1.5 degrees centigrade. Seeing this, it looks like little policy progress can be made with the next parliament. What possible coalitions do you see? What did Ursula von der Leyen, just briefly, Janis, if you would, say in relation to the Green Deal and this sense that in order to get a second term, she is rowing back, and that we will see the pressure that is on her to row back is so strong. What is your sense of what will happen to the Green Deal in the next legislative cycle?
Well, the message she was giving was not a surprise. We have achieved a lot since 2019. We have found agreement and set objectives. We have also put this into law. So we need to make sure that we reach these objectives and we need to implement. So it was much more about implementation than about formulating the policy in the next 5 years. The danger related to the second part of your question is that you might backtrack at the European level when it comes to the Green Deal, also because it costs money, but also other areas cost money, where you get to the discussion of trade-offs, where you get into discussion about what already Fabian was particularly alluding towards, the discussion about the next MFF, also the discussion we will have after the Draghi report as to whether we need common borrowing and to what extent we need common borrowing. So there will be a discrepancy between the means which are there and which politically are acceptable for the member states to achieve the objectives. And that means that you will have to have trade-offs. And there is a danger that the entire green area, which is not only related to climate change, but also related to biodiversity and other issues, that there might be a rollback in that area. There is this danger, especially if the Greens do badly in the EP elections. So the argument will be, look, this is not priority number one.
Yeah, Fabian, quick one if you would.
Yeah, just to say, I think the big danger we're facing is not necessarily that there will be an explicit rollback, because I think that is very unlikely given that the laws are in place. What we're really talking about is the question of how ambitious are we going to be about the future, and how well are we going to implement what is already there. And that's where I really see a very general movement for a slowdown. That ultimately, and we've always had that at the European level, it's mainly down to the member states to actually implement this. So if the member states are not so keen anymore on implementing it, then we'll look the other way. So I think it is a significant weakening of the green agenda, but you might not see that in terms of policy proposals or in terms of the actual legislation in place.
Indeed. Daniela, your sense of what the priorities are likely to be for the Commission, for the Council, and the degree to which really these elections will change those priorities or will not change those priorities?
Well, first of all, the heads of state and government are working on the strategic agenda right now, of course, in anticipation of the elections, but this document is in the making. And I believe that the overarching theme is really the security agenda and geo-economic risk. And I think one of the central themes that we haven't discussed that much now, but which will be for the next 5 years central to what the EU does, is economic security. A lot, again, has been achieved, and this should be highlighted, that Europe has become more alert and more able to make sure that other countries that are very present in our market, such as China, are faced with a Europe that protects its own principles and that makes itself less vulnerable to pretty aggressive state capitalism that comes into our market and that we meet on world markets. So I think this theme will stay. It cannot be detached from the green and digital transition agendas. I think this has to be seen as one big question of how we develop a competitive economic model that provides sufficient security and forms the base for European strategic autonomy. There's also a strong link, very obviously, to the security field. And here I would expect that another central issue, building on what Enrico Letta did in his report, will be how European defense industry can be shaped up to be a stronger industrial base for a Europe that is stronger in protecting itself. I don't see major progress or even the suggestion that actual national sovereignty in the field of defense should be given away to the EU. That's not going to happen. This will stay intergovernmental, but this shouldn't, this doesn't mean that there is not going to be a central proposal in the strategic guidelines to shape a base for Europe to act more in a stronger way on international security matters.
Fabian, from your perspective and this competitiveness agenda, the Green Deal seemed very much the central focus of von der Leyen 1, assuming we do, and Janis has put the warning marks on that, have a von der Leyen 2, will the Green Deal this time, last time, become the competitiveness agenda this time?
I think to some extent, yes. Competitiveness clearly is up there. I think there is also a certain degree of competitiveness as opposed to green. I think it's very important that one of the issues playing in the background here are issues such as energy prices, which clearly has a big impact on competitiveness. So I think there's almost an opposition of those two. But I think more generally, I would say that it doesn't actually matter that much when we look at the different priorities. Because broadly speaking, we pretty much agree on what the challenges are. I think the big question when it comes to all of these agendas is what is it you're actually proposing we are going to do about them? And this is the question which I think we are not really going to see debated in the European election campaign. Hopefully, we will get to a point where we have a more concrete discussion, but even that, I think, is questionable, because the moment you then start talking about what do we actually have to do to become more competitive, to become more secure, then it comes down to the question of what are the trade-offs, who's going to pay for that, what in the end is going to be the price we are going to pay to create these common European goods. And we're not at the moment going anywhere near that discussion.
And Janis, that in the area of security and defense, you've lamented many times on Update the lack of progress and the lack of actual willingness to do what it takes to build a genuine security and defense policy and genuinely make the EU work together more effectively. Do you fear, as Fabian, again, we're not going to have the discussion either here or in the development of the agenda on actually what it takes?
Yes, we will not have this. We are not having this debate. What you can expect coming out of the strategic agenda is what you nicely call a Christmas tree, with a long list of priorities and things that are important. If you look into internal documents, there's a nice 2-pager overview of what already has been discussed in the process, which Daniela was alluding to. So you have a long Christmas list. You potentially identify what number 1, 2, 3 is, but the level of ambition with respect to 1, 2, 3 will not be commensurate to what actually we have been discussing what the needs are. And Daniela is right. Member states are not ready to surrender sovereignty when it comes to defense, because at the end of the day, and that's now more obvious than it had been 5 or 10 years ago, it's a matter of life and death, if you think it through, unfortunately. So it's more about cooperation in the defense industry field. But even here, most of the debates, if you listen carefully, go in the direction, are we going to nationally invest more? How much more? and not about how much more will we cooperate and how much more will we put into a joint basket and do defense cooperation along the lines of what actually could provide the added value which defense industry cooperation could look like. We think very much national, and the money which we're putting in the pots for cooperation when it comes to defense industry cooperation is limited, because member states still think of their national champions. They think of how they will sell better. Others think of how can we make sure that we buy enough Americans so that we continue to have US support, because that's the only partner we can rely on in the area where it's most importantly NATO. So the logic of the member states is not aligned with each other, and the level of ambition is by far not the level of ambition we require, even in the defense industry sector.
Okay, thank you very much.
So good luck to the defense commissioner, sorry.
We are almost out of time, but I want to come back to where we started. We were talking about the campaign, and Daniela was talking when she talked about the lowering of the voting age in Germany and young people, and said, you know, we have to convince people that these elections do matter and they have to make a real choice, that a protest vote could be dangerous. So let me ask you to play politician for 1 minute each before we close. And if you were a politician fighting these elections, what would you say? What would your message be to the electorate as a whole, or you've targeted particularly at young voters if you want to persuade them not just to vote, because we've heard how important that is, because we don't mobilize the forces of moderation, the forces of extremism tend to do a lot better, but not only to persuade them to vote, but persuade them to vote for a positive vision of the future. Fabian, Janis, because I'd like to give Daniela the last word. She raised this issue, so I want to come back to her last. Fabian, what are you going to say? 1 minute.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. I mean, I think it's important to say, I don't think you can do this. And this is one bit we haven't really mentioned, that actually we're really close to the election now. A lot of these things would have had to happen over the last year or so. And you cannot do this in the last 4 weeks of a campaign, no matter how much you try. But I mean, I think for me, the key message is we live in an extremely challenging, difficult period of time where the problems which we are facing, security, climate change, enlargement, all of the issues we have talked about cannot be solved at the national level alone.
Yeah.
And no matter how we think about the European Union, no matter what reforms are needed, what is very clear is that at this moment in time, we need to work together. And this is a chance for people to influence that going in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Janis.
Unfortunately, the train has long left the station because the decision of how to run the campaign now, as we speak, was taken last year. And the decision was not to have the brutal honesty we have been talking about, not to have the brutal honesty about the issues which are at stake. And for me, on the basis of such a brutal, honest debate, one could have a contest among different ideas of how to react and deal with it, which then creates a positive agenda of what needs to be done. So being brutally honest does not mean that you are giving up. On the contrary, it is about saying what needs to be done and to no longer follow the logic of us against the others among the 27. So we still have this logic. Instead of defining what are the common goods, what are the only things we can, what are the things which we only can do together, and then deliver on them in terms of a level of ambition which is commensurate to the brutal honesty we have had in terms of our analysis. But again, that train has left the station a long time ago.
Thank you. Daniela, you have the last word. Try and put a bit of optimism into our hearts, can you?
I think I honestly can, because we must not forget that we have a union of 27 democracies, which is pretty unique in the world. And there are right now about 8 countries that absolutely want to join this union. And it's complicated. I know we have talked about all the problems and all the needs to reform. However, if we use that potential, if we grow in size, and if we bring in other countries that need to thoroughly agree with the principles the EU has, I think we can grow. We will grow in size and we can grow in force. The other thing is we must not forget, we look at other economic areas, the US and China, with concern. And of course, that is right. We have to protect our competitiveness. We have to become more competitive. However, we have such a potential. We have companies who are innovative. We have young entrepreneurs. We need to make sure they don't go to the West Coast in the US, and we must make sure that we fund this entrepreneurship in our place and not have others come from the outside doing that. So I think there is something to tell people, and I had a lot of positive takeaways after joining a meeting with 1,600 young people who actually came together to do their bit in campaigning. And it was really interesting to see how they all teamed up and they had super positive messages. So I'm not pessimistic at the end of the day that we have a potential to lift, but we need to put all energy into getting it lifted.
Thank you very much indeed. That is all we have time for. But just to mention, the EPC will be doing a number of events both before and after the European elections, looking ahead and then analysing the results. They've also launched a new video series. It's called EPC Policy Crossroads. And it's a video series where MEPs discuss the future of Europe in conversation with EPC analysts, looking at the strategic direction of the EU after June 2024. And the first couple of them, one on economic security, another on the Green Deal, are already online. So do take a look. Also do take a look at that paper I mentioned, the European Parliament elections 2024, getting more jitters from the mainstream than the far right. And democracy conversations, democracy reform conversations, I mentioned that as well. We will have a session on June the 5th where we will focus once again on young people, their priorities, why they will vote, how we persuade them to vote, what really matters to them. And then we will be back next month after the June summit with another update. But thank you to all of you, but particular thanks to Daniela. It is always wonderful to have you on Update. Come back soon, please. Thank you all for joining our conversation. And if you're in Brussels, I can only wish you a dry weekend. Maybe that's too much to hope for, but a pleasant weekend, whatever you're doing. Take care and goodbye.